Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone, here with Adam Rauch to talk GPP game scores as we do each week. Adam, thanks so much for joining me.
Glad to be here, Mike, as always.
Yeah, and before we dive into the week 3 GPP game scores, a little review of the past 2 weeks. So, week 1, as we noted in the review last week, there was one clear game that hit above all the rest, and it was the chalkiest game. And if you're watching on the YouTube channel, you can see this scatter plot where in the top right corner, we've got the Chargers-Dolphins game as both the highest scoring game in terms of the top 8 players average DraftKings points from that game. And the ownership of those players was on average like 16%, which is pretty high when you consider that's 8 players from that game. And no other game, even hit 19 points, and in other games were lower owned. So that's not a great week for the contrarian GPP bros. Week 2, as you can see, like really different. We didn't have one game that went absolutely nuclear, and we had a bunch of games that are kind of like low owned, higher scoring to the right. So there were a few different ways you could win, which I feel like I do better those weeks where if I'm making smart teams, Adam, like I'm correlating well. I can make 3 or 4 different stacks that like all have a chance to kind of get there and then hopefully hit on some of the one-off GPP plays around it. But you can see to the right, like San Francisco, LA, that was a game where with like Puka, Debo, minis really got there in a pretty good way. The Seattle-Detroit game that we talked about, I was worried when we talked it was going to get steamed. In fact, everyone got scared off that game, including myself a little bit, but I did play a Geno double on FanDuel. But yeah, Adam, definitely a different week 2 than we had in week 1.
Yeah, I was pretty pleased with my Jared Goff dirt plant from last week. That seemed to work out pretty well. QB3, I think, on the week, so that was nice. But yeah, it was a really unique week. I mean, you can just see all of the games, how they just kind of slid over to the right, which just basically means there were a lot more higher scoring games. In week 1, we had 8 games fall beneath the 15-point average threshold. And you can see in week 2, basically every single game was either right at that 15-point threshold or above it. Justin Herbert stacks, when I was looking at kind of what were the most successful game stacks with QBs, Herbert seemed to kind of stick out ahead of some of the others with Keenan Allen. That seemed to be a commonality in top 1% lineups, and also the Daniel Jones stacks. There wasn't an obvious pass catcher to pair him with. Some people played him with Darren Waller, and they ended up having good lineups. Some of those people even correlated that with James Conner plays. But Daniel Jones really carried those correlations as well. And yeah, that Rams-Niners game was interesting in the sense that you had Puka, you had Debo, you had CMC have strong games. Kieran Williams had a strong game. Yeah. But Stafford nor Purdy was able to kind of anchor the full game stack as far as a QB score goes. So that was a little interesting to see. But ultimately, we like having multiple ways to win, which is what we got.
Yeah, and I do think there's some, if you're playing I play in some very small field tournaments, and your note on San Francisco Rams game, the quarterbacks didn't get there, but I think one, like sometimes you can survive that, but 2, sometimes you can like make a lineup that's like 2 game stacks, right? Like you can have San Francisco, LA with Seattle, Detroit, or whatever, or actually it was kind of a cheap game too, so you could have fit that with Herbert Keenan, and Herbert Keenan was a good example of how the stat can pay off without it being perfect, where Keenan was a huge win because not only was his raw point total good, but when you look at the expensive wide receivers, they kind of failed across the board. They either failed or just were average in terms of like Diggs, Adams, Jamar Chase, Calvin Ridley. The only one that really kind of went off was the 1% owned CeeDee Lamb, which didn't really hurt you. So there's huge separation. And then if you play Derrick Henry coming back, it was like fine. And then sometimes that's the way it happens. Like there's a correlated piece that's good enough, and then you get on a piece that really helps you to separate.
It would have been really fun to see if Anthony Richardson could have finished the Colts-Texans game, because that ended up doing pretty well. But Richardson had to leave after scoring 2 rushing touchdowns in the first quarter. So hopefully we get him back this week. We'll see.
Yep. And looking at the table for this week, right now, the best game is the Chargers-Minnesota game. And really, I mean, if you look at the game totals, it has a 54 game total. And then second is Denver-Miami at 48.5. You've got Chicago-KC at 47, which is mostly the KC side. And, it's just two teams that have played kind of up tempo, that have shown an ability to have like high pass rates. So this game looks pretty juicy, but everyone's going to see it. We'll see where the ownership comes in at. Like, for example, our first run of ownership, which is pretty raw. We're recording this on Thursday afternoon. Mike Williams is at 24% in large field. Maybe that's even higher. Our small field ownership on him is 37. Kind of similarly, Josh Kelly, assuming Eckler out again, our large field ownership at this point in time is 22, small field 35. So these are absolutely the steam candidates in this game, Adam.
And if people are wondering, well, it's got a 54 total. It's by far the highest on the week. Why is the game score not really separating that much from the others when if it has such a high total and such a high projected ceiling? I mean, the ownership is the simple answer. And again, as you said, it's a raw run on Thursday for ownership, but it kind of makes sense that this game would get steamed the most. But how you can kind of play off of that is maybe you look to target some of the lower projected owned pieces in this game. TJ Hawkinson is not a comfortable click, but he is projecting for lower ownership. That may rise as this game gets steamed up throughout the week. But typically when we have these games where both sides are projecting for high pace, high ceiling, high ownership, my strategy is to just try to find a piece here and there that you can mix in that can kind of contrast against the chalkier pieces. But I think there's a balance there. You don't want to not play any of the chalk because there's a reason this game is grading out so well. But we, at the same time, I don't know if you'd want to play Josh Kelly, Mike Williams, and Justin Jefferson in the same lineup if they all end up at the ownerships we think they will.
Yeah, and I have found, like, looking at some of the correlated stuff, like if you're going to play this game, as you said, you can't get around the chalk. Like if the game hits, it's going to hit, but it might also carry one of those low-owned pieces. I could see Alexander Mattison coming in lower with the Cam Akers signing and Cam Akers trade, and people, just really off Mattison because he's been so bad. But I actually think, like, for his price and like for how the roles are going to shake out, that he's pretty reasonable.
And
you also have guys,
the matchup too.
Yeah, we know the Chargers will kind of intentionally cede some rushing efficiency to try and deflate opposing teams passing. And Jordan Addison is someone that's not going to project well because, like, there's still so much competition for targets, and he's still running less routes than KJ Osborne. I guess Osborne in that category too. Like, just taking a chance on one of those two wide receivers seems like a good way to play. And you can also just be cognizant of what you're filling in around it. Like if you're in a small field, you play this game stack, it's going to be really chalky. You're going to want some like 5% plays around it.
Agreed.
Let's look at the next game on our list, which is Denver-Miami. It's just, this Miami offense is absurd. I was doing the projections for Miami earlier today and like trying to get their team efficiency in line, and Tua's yards per completion the last two seasons is just like nowhere near anybody else. It's like 13 plus, and like everybody else is like generally like around 11 or so. So it's just like out of control. But yeah, I mean, the question is like, who do you pick on the Denver side of this game? And even Miami, as strong as they are, sometimes it can be difficult to really pin that down. I do think if you play Miami to go off, it's okay to include the running back in that mix. But also, man, I like Durham Smythe too as part of a correlated piece, Adam, but the initial ownership on him is like mid-teens, which just kind of seems high for, we've seen like so much chalk failure already the first 2 weeks with Likely and Musgrave that there's no way I'm playing Smythe unless it's part of the game stack. And I like Smythe.
Yeah, I like Smythe too. And that's initially where my mind went when looking at the prices for this game. The advantage of playing Miami stacks is most of the time when Tua doubles hit, we kind of know where those points are going to go. But at the same time, Denver has a multitude of receivers that they could go to with varying target shares and route participation. So it makes it a little bit tricky to game stack, but that'll give us some opportunities. That'll give people some opportunities to kind of be on some plays that I think people are hesitant to be on. But yeah, Smythe is an easy salary saver plug-in at tight end that makes your stack more affordable and more doable to fill in the rest of your lineup. It makes sense, I think, why his ownership is getting where it is.
Yeah, and I would note on FanDuel where the pricing gets a little different at tight end, people are going to be funneled to him less. Like they're starving for that punt tight end on DraftKings always, not so much on FanDuel. And he's kind of a better FanDuel play anyways because he's got like a good 8 out for a tight end. He does run a lot of routes, but he's never going to be targeted a bunch because of the high target per out run for Tyreek and Waddle. So like you're banking on some efficiency for him. So I do like it on FanDuel a little bit better. And on FanDuel too, you get, you get Judy at a good price tag. It's hard to I don't know if I'd play the Russ side, if you can double that, but even Javonte Williams is at like a decent, there's definitely options on the Denver side. I don't know if I'd play the Denver side as a stack. I think it'd be like a Tua, Tyreek, Smythe thing. I like it better on FanDuel. And one thing with Tyreek, Adam, that we always talk about, but when you get these receivers that just have these unique ceilings, 20 to 30% is fine.
Right.
They get to 50%. Yeah, you're worth fading. You 20 to 30, you don't have to play them, but you don't have to fade them either.
Right. Right now we have Tyreek at around 16 in small field, 14 in large field. I mean, that's great. I mean, for the ceiling that he has, and by the way, he's got the highest ceiling projection of any wide receiver on the slate. I mean, that's what you're looking for. So absolutely, I absolutely agree with you 100% there.
Yeah, and we'll see how that shakes out. And that'll pivot off. We talked about this Chargers Minnesota game, but right now we have people going to Jefferson a bit more. So it'll be interesting to kind of see if people go to Jefferson or Tyreek up top there.
Just a quick question for you, Mike. What do you think about Waddle? Because I'm not exactly sure where you think his ownership's going to end up. He's not a great value, but again, he's got that ceiling that we know where that concentration is going to go if Tua hits big.
Yeah, I like Waddle. I like him a little bit more if you're playing maybe something mid-sized or like larger field. But I do think there's some input volatility right now with him where we're projecting a 20% target share because Tyreek's just been such an alpha there. But there were times last year where it looked a little bit closer to maybe Waddle was more like mid-20s, which, doesn't sound like a huge difference. But for a team that's not necessarily flooded with a ton of pass attempts, but is super efficient, it does make a pretty big difference to just get another target or two in that projection. And if you look at, I know people can't see the projections right now, but if you sort on ceiling, he's going to be another guy too, where he pops up in terms of ceiling, with a ceiling of 28, kind of up there with Chris Olave, who's a bit better value. And he starts to separate from guys like Michael Pittman, who he's similar on base projection, but we definitely have Waddle much higher in ceiling. Granted, there's a salary disparity, but yeah, that salary might be a gift to people this week because you might get Waddle sub 5%.
Right.
Let's go to Houston, Jacksonville. This game's kind of exciting. You mentioned, Adam, last week that the A-Rich Stroud stuff looked pretty enticing. That game was shooting off. Unfortunately, A-Rich got hurt. But both these teams, what's really fun to see from a fantasy perspective is they're playing up-tempo, fast pace. And for Houston, trusting their rookie quarterback. With, of course, this week's matchup is against Jacksonville, not Indy, but Jacksonville, they bounced back in terms of play calling last week. I wonder if week 1 against the Colts, they just had a more conservative game plan and maybe not realizing how the Colts were going to play that one. But we did see the pass rate over expectation trend positive and more pace for Jacksonville in week 2. So I don't know what we see week 3 out of Jacksonville. That's a question mark where I kind of just assumed every game they were going to call aggressively. Do they call it like they did week 1 or not? But if Houston can push Jacksonville, I think this is where the correlations make a lot of sense because I think I don't think it makes sense to play Jacksonville without a Houston piece is basically what I'm getting at.
Right. And, interestingly enough, the Colts got out ahead last week in Houston, and they were, at least before, they were using Richardson in the running game, and he was very productive before he got hurt. But then they kind of went towards Zach Moss later in the game, he just carved their run defense up, and it didn't matter because they would score quickly, and even though they were running, they were scoring quickly, which gave CJ Stroud opportunities to kind of be in comeback mode. And it kind of sets up similarly here. I think we have another scenario where Houston's going to be in a trailing game script, and Bobby Slowick, the OC, has not been shy about letting CJ Stroud rip it when they're down. That hasn't always been the case in the past with previous quarterbacks, but they've got two solid receivers in Nico Collins and Tank Dell who are projecting as slight values. So if you're going to game stack it, I would definitely want one of those guys, even if you think it's going to be kind of a Travis Etienne game. Again, it's a great spot for him as well, and his passing role helps on DraftKings certainly. But I would agree. I think I would still want a Houston piece on the way back.
Yeah, and if you've got the stones, Etienne, as you mentioned, sets up great for him, but the field's seen it. We kind of got him at 20% ownership on DraftKings right now. We have Ridley, Kirk, Zay Jones for combined, not too much more than what we have Etienne at in large field, and in small field. I think Etienne kind of even outpaces those guys, and those ownerships will get more dialed in over the weekend. But if anything remotely like that holds, the Lawrence even triple in a small field where you get one really good performance from one of the three wide receivers, you get two good enough ones, you get the leverage against the chalk Etienne, and then hopefully you get a Houston piece coming back. You mentioned Dell and Nico Collins. I wish I played more Nico Collins last week. I liked him. I'm worried he's going to steam a little bit more than our default ownership. People were actually on him he was single digits last week, but he was higher single digits. I thought he was even going to be low single digits. So I'm a little worried on the steam there. But yeah, that game looks pretty good.
One final note on that game. We got some news this morning that Derek Stingley, the Texans' top corners, has a hamstring injury and will definitely miss this game, and if not a few games. There's a chance he may even go on IR. And the Texans secondary is just absolutely decimated right now. So just with that news alone, those Lawrence stacks look even more appealing.
Let's jump over to FanDuel to talk about this KC Chicago game, because it's our last green highlighted game in the GPP game scores. And this rate's much better on FanDuel. Just the way, Chicago racks up points, it's not ever going to be from a ton of receptions. So you also get the wider salary spread with either Herbert or Roschon Johnson. Interesting. If you think Johnson overtakes Herbert, he's only 4,700 on FanDuel, which that's really, really cheap as far as the wide salary spread at running back. And then KC, you do lose the bonus potential for Mahomes and the full PPR for Kelsey over there, but it makes it easier for one of the ancillary pass catchers on a double to get there, where if they just find the end zone, talking like MDS, Tony types there. So, and Pacheco rates really well too. So there's a few different ways you can play it. You could play Pacheco from ahead and then play maybe a field skinny stack and take advantage of the field's rushing, or you could maybe play a Mahomes double and go cheap at running back for Chicago. But there's some value here at no one's playing any of the Chicago pieces.
No, and the primary benefit of having them is that they're just going to give you that salary relief if you decide to play any of their pass catchers or running backs, which is what you're going to need, especially if you want to play Mahomes, Kelsey correlations. Again, it's the same thing we talk about every week with Kansas City. Mahomes and Kelsey you're going to pay for, but identifying the lower priced pass catchers in a stack is going to be a crapshoot. You just don't know what you're going to get every week. But yeah, if I was going to take a chance on a couple of guys, I think it would be Tony or MVS this week. They're projecting for pretty low ownership. So But I like the note about Pacheco. I mean, he's an immense value on FanDuel this week, and kind of excited to see what he can do in a game setup like this.
Yeah, they eased him in week one. He did have some injury stuff over the offseason, but last week he really carried the bulk of the carries and was a little bit more efficient than he was in week one. After that, Adam, it's kind of like a bunch of games in the middle. Every now and then, one of these red games I like more than the GPP game scores suggests. That's not this week. I'm out on Tennessee, Cleveland, New England, New York. Should mention too with New England, New York that there is some potential weather stuff on the East Coast. So that's not super baked into our projections right now. As we get closer to lock, if it persists, if there's some wind and rain, we'll adjust. That would also affect the Buffalo Washington game, which I'm surprised the total is not higher, but maybe it's part of that weather. Washington's been pretty plus PROE, so there's some interest there. I know Jahan Dotson was on the by Leone model for this week, but in general, kind of just have a bunch of games in the middle here. I know you were looking a little bit at Atlanta, Detroit. You running back your golf dirt plant?
Yeah, I just can't. I can't. I have to revel in the take a little bit longer. So I thought I'd bring it up one more time. But no, I think Bijan Robinson's role is so good that even in a trailing game script, I mean, I think he works in a game stack regardless of the script. Is what I'm trying to say. And if we can get a scenario again where maybe we can get Detroit out ahead earlier in the game, Goff has another good game at home. He always does well at home. He does a lot better at home than he does on the road. Then maybe we could get, some heavier PROE from the Falcons. Although I'm not going to hold my breath on that. They've already kind of shown us that that Arthur Smith will do anything he possibly can to not have to be a positive PROE team. So we'll see on that. I just kind of like the dynamic of some of the weapons in that game, how they interact with each other. I'm not feeling exuberant about it per se, but I just kind of like the setup there a little bit more than some of the other middling games that we're looking at.
Yeah, the note on Bijan's a good one too about him being useful regardless of the script. And we'll see if he gets a bump because there's so much hype around him right now. But I know on FanDuel, like people are building like the value running back route, it looks like on an early ownership projection. So that's a good way to sort of flip the bill, so to speak. And then Jahmyr Gibbs, I think, has a pretty good ceiling with Montgomery out. I do expect Craig Reynolds to play like an annoying amount of the time. And like even he himself is like not the worst GPP play, like near minimum running back salary. But Gibbs is on the by Leone this week for running back, and look for him to do a little bit more of the opportunities that he's given moving forward. The Baltimore Colts game is interesting too, Adam, where you mentioned if we get Richardson back, we know Indy's playing at a faster pace than they were last year. And we kind of thought the pace stuff might happen with Steichen, but didn't expect the pass rate over expectation to be as positive as it's been. And also didn't expect Richardson to be as good as he's been throwing the football. So if they can push Baltimore, maybe we see Monken go full Monken. We haven't totally gotten the Monken effect for Baltimore, but they've also kind of played some boring games from ahead. And I think there's some potential there. We also see the Ravens pass game condense a little bit with Odell Beckham. I believe he's out or likely to be out in this one for the Ravens.
Yeah, we'll see about Odell Beckham, but I think people are going to be pretty hesitant to play Baltimore stacks. We haven't seen that Monken style offense truly manifest yet in any of Baltimore's games, but I mean, Lamar Jackson, Mark Andrews correlations. I mean, it's kind of tough sometimes to play it on a slate where you can get stacks with a little better value, but I mean you kind of know, okay, if Odell is out, you're going to have Lamar, you're going to have Mark Andrews, and Zay Flowers is going to roll. Should increase. So, I think those guys are a little appealing there. Jackson and Andrews are coming in below 10%. I don't think that's going to get above that. I think those guys are going to be played pretty marginally. And yeah, we'll see about Richardson's status. But even without Richardson in there, the Colts offense had no problem operating last week in Houston with Minshew under center. Even Michael Pittman's got there a little bit last week. I mean, he was kind of getting some volume there, getting some receptions. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, tempted to even throw Josh Downs as like kind of a gross name in there. He kind of showed out last week, played pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
Might get an increased workload this week, so we'll see. It's another kind of average projecting game, but one of the more interesting ones.
Yeah, you got Granson at tight end too. I do think I like it a little bit better on FanDuel than DraftKings, which is kind of interesting. Our game scores kind of has it the same, but just looking at the Baltimore pieces seem like it's just harder for them to get there value wise on DK than on FanDuel. All right, I don't see too much else here. Maybe something on Carolina, Seattle with Geno stuff and hoping Miles Sanders coming back. Maybe they just, run into something. It looks like Bryce Young's probably going to be out there and Andy Dalton's going to play. I don't see too much else though. So let's go to the dirt plants. Adam, I'll let you go first. I'm still kind of thinking through.
Man, it's a little bit of a tough week for me for dirt plants. Originally my answer was going to be Durham Smythe, but I just don't know if he constitutes as like a gross play because
I was thinking it too.
On him. I mean, but people are kind of on him, so I don't know if that's truly considered gross enough. I mean, the essence of a dirt play is not only someone who's going to be, kind of a lower salary or not as great of a value, but just like no one is going to think to play this guy. That's how I like the dirt plants. I don't know. I mean, maybe we'll say Durham. Maybe I'll say Durham Smythe as a cop out. But if you want a really, really gross play, I think if Andy Dalton plays in Seattle, I think that actually might be better for Carolina this week. And maybe Adam Thielen will be the dirt plant of the week.
That's the epitome of a dirt plant is Adam Thielen.
Yes.
I think Smythe is acceptable on FanDuel as a dirt plant. I don't think it's a multi-site dirt plant, but I'll take it on FanDuel. Man, it's early in the week, so this stuff is, subject to change, but I'll go Alexander Madison as a way to play this Chargers-Minnesota game. I just think between the Akers stuff and how bad Madison's been, everybody is ripping on this dude. And I think as bad as it seems right now, it's probably not quite that bad. And this is sort of the spot. If he's horrible again this week, sort of throwing the towel on him, but I think it's a good gamble to take.
We got to hope for it. I got too many shares of him to let him fail this week. So it better be this week.
Let's go. I mean, it's sort of now or never for him.
Yep.
But thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. Best of luck in week 3, and we'll be back here for week 4.